Hello friends, my name is Bethany, and today I will be reviewing and discussing Corinne by Rebecca Morrow. This is an adult contemporary or romance book written under a pseudonym about a woman named Corinne who is cast out from her fundamentalist church, and after she ends up leaving, moving away from her hometown and kind of creating a life for herself, she returns to this town in Kansas to be closer to her family and to her mother, and she ends up crossing paths once again with the man that she fell in love with when she was a teen, when she was cast out. And they end up reconnecting over the course of this book, but it's also an exploration of her growing up in this fundamentalist church and like the sort of relationship that these two people can form now that he is still in the church and she has been cast out. This book was published in July 2022, and I will be completely honest and say that this book was like nowhere on my radar until Mara told me about it. We had just finished a live show on a previous topic, and she had mentioned that she wanted to discuss this book because she had heard theories primarily over on TikTok about who was the actual author of this book. So she wanted us to read it, review it, and then, give our own sort of theories on who the author could be. That live show is already up. It was Mara, Bethany, Ashley, Rachel, and myself, and we went through our impressions of the books and we talked a little bit about our theories that we had. But since finishing that live show and really sitting with the books, I realized that not only did I have like enough feelings for a standalone review, but I kept digging into who the author could be, and I'm almost like I am 99% certain I know who wrote this book. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And we'll start with my impression of the book. I have been thinking a lot about how I have talked in previous years about like intent versus impact, specifically when I'm talking about things that are like problematic in some way, and people want to talk about how like the intent of the author wasn't to harm, right? This idea that the impact sort of trumps the intent in that case, because if people were harmed, that is kind of what matters the most in that instance to me, regardless of what the author's intent was. And for the most part, I think of myself as a reader who only cares like very little about the author's intent at any given moment, or I should say that I care very little about the author's intent in the grand scheme of my own analysis and my impression of the story, right? It can be useful information, and there have certainly been instances for me where knowing the intent was additive to my experience, but generally I am not somebody who like craves or needs or like searches or researches author intent. It stands out to me because in this case, in this instance, this is somewhere where all I can keep thinking about having read this book is like this question of what exactly the author intended. And this is a case where like knowing that intent, I think like my experience of this book kind of hinges on that. And at a very basic level, I just need to understand what this book is and what it was trying to achieve. Because I don't know that I do from having just read the book myself. I'm going to back up a little bit here and start with some positives. And I will say that this book started off really strong for me. I was hooked from the beginning, and I think that the thing that it does best really is capture some of this experience of growing up in a fundamentalist religion, specifically having like a teenaged experience around that. There were so many moments that I found incredibly relatable and well captured. And I think the portion of the story that is firmly rooted in a teenage voice is the best portion of the story. Later, when the main character grows up, it kind of gets away from the author for a number of reasons. But one of those reasons definitely is the way that the teenage voice felt more authentic to me than like the voice of a 32-year-old woman. The bit about some of the strengths here being sort of capturing that experience of being cast out from the church and her like as an adult deconstructing some of what she was taught and some of what she experienced really is like two sides of the same coin in terms of like one of the strengths but also one of the weaknesses of the book, because there were times where this felt like very purposeful commentary, and there were times where it felt like things were leaking out that the author didn't fully sort of deconstruct on their own, that there were things being showed to us that I read and interpreted as also like symptoms of somebody who grew up in a fundamentalist environment that I don't think were necessarily like thought about or deconstructed to the level that some of the other commentary was as well. That brings me back to my original question of what exactly is this story? Because if it's a romance, this was one of the worst and most uncomfortable romances that I have read in like a long time. There is a way that the writing is clean and relatively well edited that I think elevates it above some of like truly the worst things I have ever read. But as a romance, the core of this, the relationship, the sex scenes, like, but this is so uncomfortable. This is so poorly constructed in terms of like how we are seeing these characters relate to each other and fall in love and experience the scope of the story together. If this is, however, like a literary fiction work where it is instead presenting to us something that is meant to be uncomfortable, where like the lens that it is using to show us this romance and like leave us with all of these questions, if that is like a purposeful thing, if that was the intent, then this did a better job at doing that, at the uncomfortable thing, at looking at the ways that these two people would like miss each other because of the ways that they grew up and what they experienced. That framing of it changes things for me than the framing of this is a story of two people who fell in love. I can't tell you which of those things is true or what the intent of the author was. We will probably circle back around to this when we talk about who I think the author is. I will say that as part of like the investigation, looking into the clues of who this could be, one of the things that we looked into, Mara mentioned on the live show that this is one of the first things that you do when there is like an anonymous author, is look at the Library of Congress. The copyright is issued to Rebecca Morrow, but the categories that this is listed under is romance and erotic fiction. Uncomfortable. The sex scenes in this were incredibly weird. And the thing is that is bad news for this book, because after the first half of this, as we're establishing this relationship and then seeing her get cast out, like that really is the inciting incident here. And the rest of the book is just very sex heavy. And it is just kind of them coming to terms with like now they have a relationship as adults. That is one of the reasons that I left feeling like this is probably a romance, because the focus shifts so heavily to just like the relationship portion of this. But I cannot stress enough how uncomfortable I found all of the sex scenes in this. And there are a number of things that like feed into this that are also like larger complaints that I have about this book. One is that it is incredibly repetitive. The writing style is also very simple, and the author tends to use really short sentences, so it creates a very readable but very like simple and almost like monotone or like staccato style, which is also sort of emphasized by all of the repetition. And this comes in several forms: a tendency to repeat certain words, a very specific choice to say the main male character's name over and over and over again. Like the main female character is so obsessed that she's often just thinking his name, Enoch, 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 in 3 parts like that, over and over again. But even when they're talking to each other or she's thinking about him, she names him constantly. That was part of the repetition, but also the way that the author was trying to build like romantic tension here came through a lot of repetition. And we had those like really short chapters. There is a series at the beginning where like these two kids who are incredibly sheltered, they've like held hands for the first time, they've kissed for the first time, and we're seeing this like the build up of this like big dramatic moment for this character in some like repetitions of these very short chapters where she's like, we held hands and we sat together, and then it's like, you know, fast forward to the next week, we did it again. And it's a stylistic choice. It feels like a very purposeful choice to build that dramatic tension and that romantic tension, but it didn't work for me. One, because I think it was a little overwrought, a little overdone. It does match with the tone of a teenager and sort of like the importance of that moment to that character, but it keeps happening. This is something that this character continues to do and that the story continues like tonally throughout. So it just didn't work for me from that perspective of feeling a little angsty, over dramatic, and overwrought. But also, as a reader who is sensitive to repetition, I was like, oh my God, move on. The other thing that makes it incredibly uncomfortable is the way that the author talks about bodies. The way that she describes the main male character's body is always like really, really strange and uncomfortable. And even when the main female character is telling us that she finds him attractive, it is almost like against her will. And the way she describes him is never like with any sort of like love or affection or like truly thinking he is attractive in any way. It is always with the weirdest, most uncomfortable, most unattractive sort of adjectives, like his beady eyes and his puffy lips and his square body. I don't know. It just, the entire thing was like very unsexy, unromantic to me. Ultimately, while I do think that there were some things here that were compelling, and there were some things that were also well observed, specifically, like I said, surrounding like this way of growing up and life in the Midwest and things along those lines, I don't think that this was entirely successful in terms of its writing and the story it told. One of the impressions that I walked away with was like, what was the point of the story? And I'm not sure that I've totally figured it out. That is related to this idea of like, what genre is this even? But even apart from that, like, I don't know what we were supposed to walk away with from the story in terms of our characters. Like, what were we supposed to feel for them exactly in terms of like what we saw? This is the part that I think gets super confusing to me, because I don't know if at the end of this we were supposed to be happy for our characters or concerned, because I genuinely was concerned. And so all of this confusion to me just didn't paint the story well overall. And then on top of that, I don't think that it was particularly strong in its writing, in its plotting, or in its characterizations. We were joking and calling it spiritual horror on the live show, because if this is like meant to make us incredibly uncomfortable with the situation that this character is in, with this idea that even though she was cast out and she created this whole life sort of apart from the church, she ends up getting brought back in certain ways. She never goes back to church, and she's very adamant about not going back. But there is this eerie sense that there are so many ways that the church has still infiltrated her life and the people around her, and how much influence it still has on her life and the way she's living it and how she will continue to live it. It is so eerie, the way that you feel like this woman is still trapped by the church without being in the church. And if capturing that eeriness and making us feel uncomfortable was the point, then I would give this like a 3 stars, 2.5 to 3 stars. This brings us around to, who is Rebecca Morrow? I want to pause here for a little bit and talk about like the ethics of trying to unmask or uncover an anonymous author. If this person wanted to be truly anonymous, the like author bio would have been like, Rebecca Morrow is a woman who lives in the Midwest with her children, whatever. By letting us know that it is a pseudonym for a New York Times bestselling author, this becomes something slightly different to me. It does feel like more purposefully like a marketing ploy. Like you are inviting people to speculate by telling us this, right? That's the way that it feels to me, at least. We talked a lot about what could be the purpose of writing this book specifically anonymously. And because of the person that I think it is, I think probably a big driving factor here is just separation between the kind of work that they usually write and this as sort of romantic or erotic fiction. I think that it makes sense to have a separation between what the sport person normally writes and this. I don't know that secrecy was like the thing that they were going for. And if secrecy was the thing that they were going for, there's no such thing as truly secret when you are publishing something for public consumption. I feel like I'm playing right into the hands of the publicity stunt of this all, honestly, more than I feel like I am unmasking somebody who wanted to keep this really hush-hush and secret, to be honest. But I will say, please don't like take this and go after the author in my name. Don't ask them if this is them. Like, don't That's unnecessary. I just read this. I read that author bio. We talked about who it could be. And the more that I looked into it, the more I'm like, I feel like I have the answer, and that's why I'm sharing. Again, don't bother the author. This is ultimately still a guess, right? I don't have confirmation that what I'm saying is true. I just have a deep feeling that what I'm saying is true. So, leave the author alone. If they ever want to confirm or deny, they will do so. If not, we can just have fun speculating. When Mara had talked to me about doing this live show and talking about who the author could be, she had told me, and we framed it as like, did Stephenie Meyer write this? Because that was the prevailing theory, and for a number of reasons. One, Stephenie Meyer is a very prominent best-selling author that we know has ties to a fundamentalist sort of religion. She is Mormon. So when you think of like popular authors who are religious, like, of course, Stephenie Meyer is going to jump up to the top of the list. There were also some things within the story and the writing that I think people associate with Stephenie Meyer. So, for instance, the sort of descriptions around the main male character's hair and like the way that she calls it, like several different colors that are all a little bit weird and wacky, is a very Stephenie Meyer thing. When you think about Edward's like bronze hair, it was always like some version of bronze or whatever. Like that kind of thing happens a lot when we're talking about Enoch. There was also a couple of uses of imprinting in here. Corinne talks about how Enoch has been imprinted on her, which is another like hugely Stephenie Meyer sort of concept. Tragedy, crime against humanity. That association was there as well. As I was reading, I pretty quickly dismissed Stephenie Meyer as the author for myself because I didn't feel like the hallmarks of her actual writing were here. I mentioned that these sentences were really short. It was very readable. It had that very like clean, simple style. Stephenie Meyer tends to use sentences that are more overpacked. Every punctuation, fragment of a sentence that you can pack into a sentence, Stephenie Meyer does that. And often that confuses her meaning a lot. Stephenie Meyer writes in a way that you often have to go back and go, what? Like, what is she talking about here? Just because of that, like, lack of paying attention to grammar rules or whatever that she has and that is, like, indicative of her writing to me. So while I was reading this, it wasn't giving Stephenie Meyer in that regard. We put forward other guesses, a lot of them gleaned from Reddit, where people were theorizing, TikTok, and a couple of Goodreads reviews. So Rainbow Rowell's name was thrown out there. Ellen Hildebrand was thrown out there as well. Jodi Picoult was like my favorite guess. Ashley guessed that because Jodi Picoult actually blurbed this book. So the idea that Jodi Picoult blurbed her own book was really, really funny to us. The other theory that they all really enjoyed that I was like, absolutely not, was that like multiple authors wrote this. Like a cabal of authors got together and put all of their religious trauma into a book. I refuse to believe that or even entertain it for funsies because the idea that more than one person wrote this like breaks my brain. I cannot accept that is a thing that happened, that multiple people did this on purpose and read it and went, yeah, that was good. I have too much faith in humanity for that to be the case. As we were putting this together of like clues of who it could be and we're just like using this to guide our searches, there were a number of things that we decided like were probably true about this. So very clearly, this is a person who has a background with a fundamentalist religion. I don't think that you can actually decide which from reading this book because there are a lot of ways that pieces feel taken from different sort of fundamentalist religions. And there are a lot of ways that very obvious signs or terms or like identifying marks for these religions are left out. It feels like this is like fundamentalist Christian religion with the serial numbers filed off. So there was a portion of this where I was trying to identify what denomination this was or what it could have been. But I think this purposefully leaves you in a sort of like, you know, it could be any of them sort of state. So while that led some of my search while going through this, ultimately, I don't think that like we could say this author needs to be Mormon or Jehovah's Witness or even evangelical or what have you. I do think that this person is from the Midwest. This is set in Kansas, and I think that that is a very specific choice. There is a way that like some of these fundamentalist denominations take on different flavors, cultures, lives of their own if you set them like in a southern setting, right? And that's what I have the most experience with. Florida, the South, close enough. So that felt purposeful to me, and it made it seem likely to me that we were looking for somebody who lives in the Midwest. And because of the time that this was set and the time that this person was a teenager, I think we are looking for an author who grew up in the 90s. And this is published by St. Martin's Press, and because of the way that it's like positioned, like Rebecca Morrow is this New York Times bestselling author, I think it is logical to assume that this is an author who has a previous relationship with St. Martin's Press. I think that those are the main sort of like checklist items that make the most sense to me. So we ended it, and we really didn't have like a conclusion of who we thought was like, you know, our number one suspect here. I did go back to my Discord and just like word vomit all of these extra and additional feelings that I had, especially because after reading it, I kind of had a book hangover because of this. I couldn't stop thinking about the experience of reading it. I couldn't stop thinking about all of the feelings that it gave me and this like question of what exactly this book was trying to achieve. So I went back to my Discord. I was talking to them there, and in my Discord, as I was telling people, please don't read this, but also if you read it, like tell me about it. A few people decided to read it. So we have like a buddy chat going, and one person found a Goodreads review where they said that like they confirmed that the editor of Corinne is the same editor that Rowell uses. And so I was like, okay. we're back on the case. I am not done looking into this. I went to my library and I checked out everything that they had available by Rowell, including the last Simon and Baz book, Landline Attachments. I already had a copy of Eleanor in Part because I read that years and years and years ago. And the first place that I went, I did this very purposefully. I was like, I want to see like a kissing scene that Rowell has already wrote. I was pretty confident that there would be a kissing scene in the Simon and Baz book. So I literally pulled up a copy of it, searched for like kiss. And the thing that stood out to me immediately was this description of like the characters pushing against each other. Because I mentioned in Corinne, there was this tendency to repeat words over and over and over again. And one of the words that was very highly repeated was push. And every time we were having a kissing scene or a sex scene, the main character kept describing it as just like pushing against each other. And here was this scene written previously where again, this author had described like kissing as like pushing faces together or whatnot. And I was like, I started skimming more of Rowell's books, and the second thing that jumped out to me was that the writing style was incredibly similar. Like, I'm not like a forensic analyst here, but Rowell tends to use these short sentences, and she loves a parenthetical. The other thing she really loves is sort of like a remembered conversation or like a phone conversation, and it's very easy to pick up on this sort of thing because those conversations are italicized in the work. So you're very easily able to identify like all of these sections of italicized writing where these represent conversations that are either happening in the past or they might be phone conversations or things along those lines. Another thing that Rowell does a lot that was also present here is pop culture references. There was a lot of emphasis here, and it makes sense for the book, on like worldly music and movies and whatnot, because this is a character who grew up sort of sheltered from that, wasn't allowed to participate. So she thinks a lot about these like cultural touchstones or whatnot, the experiences of consuming this music and these movies. But generally, Rowell loves her pop culture reference. Also, when you look up Rebecca Morrow on Goodreads, in her like bio, she just has a link to a playlist on Spotify. It's a playlist for Corinne. Interestingly enough, there is like a working playlist for Corinne Book 2, which also that blew my mind a little bit in terms of like what the story is doing and where we go from here and what the like intent was here. Wild. But Rainbow Rowell has playlists for every single one of her books. Lots of authors do this, but like not every author does this. Rainbow Rowell always has a playlist for her books. And so that just feels like another like piece of this that is like, okay, yes, that checks out. From there, I looked into this editor thing. So I actually went into the acknowledgments of all of the books that I checked out and saw that Rainbow Rowell repeatedly thanked Sarah Goodman as her editor. And I just put Sarah Goodman's name into Google, and like one of the first results you get is a Goodreads attached to this name, Sarah Goodman. I cannot confirm or deny that this is like the Sarah Goodman, but this person who is Sarah Goodman on Goodreads belongs to one Goodreads group, and it is the Rainbow Rowell fan group. And she has marked like 16 books read and has rated 16 books total. A handful of them are from Rainbow Rowell, and one of them is Corinne. Now, she marked it as read and rated it 5 stars in March of 2022. This book came out in July of 2022, so this person had access to this book before it was published. Sarah Goodman read this before everybody else did, rated it 5 stars, is Rainbow Rowell's editor. After I had laid all of this out for my Discord of like, okay, here's all these things that I found, I think it's Rainbow Rowell. Somebody made a comment asking like, can you imagine that you like wrote this book and you published it and people were like, oh, read it, and we're like, this must be Stephenie Meyer. Like, how insulting. And I laughed. I agreed. I was like, I would like stop writing. I would hang up my pen. I would never write again. If I wrote something and somebody read it and was like, oh, was this written by Stephenie Meyer? I would be mortified. And and one of my friends from the Discord, Amy, was like, are you kidding? She would be honored. And I didn't know that like Rainbow Rowell and Stephenie Meyer, like there was any commonality there. And Amy was able to actually find old copies of blog posts Rainbow Rowell had written, and one of them was a defense of Stephenie Meyer's writing. Like the article was basically like, Stephenie Meyer is a good writer, actually. So rest assured that Rainbow Rowell is not insulted by you thinking that her book was actually written by Stephenie Meyer. This led us down another rabbit hole of like looking at old blog posts that Rainbow had written, and specifically deleted scenes from attachments that she had posted. And there are like a ton more similarities here. One, Rainbow wrote a lot about enjoying Twilight and like the things in Twilight that she appreciated, and she specifically mentioned how much she liked the romantic tension that existed in Twilight. That like that was the thing that Stephenie Meyer was best at building, was the tension between these two characters. And the idea that the tension between Bella and Edward is romantic at all, like convinces me that Rainbow Rowell thinks Corinne is also a romance, and like very purposefully created this sort of dynamic between these two main characters that she and probably many others find romantic, but that is like deeply disturbing to me personally. And all of the things that were in this writing that led people to believe it was Stephenie Meyer now feels like somebody emulating something that they really loved and admire. Like imprinting feels like a choice, and while it is easy to assume it would be a choice Stephenie Meyer made, it is actually more logical to think that it is a choice that a fan of Stephenie Meyer's work made. In some of this writing about Twilight, Rainbow Rowell talked about how Twilight is a story about what happens when you become unevenly yoked with a vampire, which like religious humor, but also Corinne is a story about what happens when you become unevenly yoked with somebody. Corinne feels like somebody took the pieces, the romantic tension that they enjoyed in Twilight, and they took all of the sort of Mormon propaganda, the purity culture propaganda that Stephenie Meyer built into Twilight under like the guise of this like paranormal fantasy, and they stripped away the paranormal fantasy and they just brought over the like propaganda piece of it, and they tried to deconstruct some of it, but were not actually successful in deconstructing all of it, especially around the things that remain unchallenged, including all of the ways that bodies are described, including all of the ways that like the weirdness around sex and relationships. I mentioned that we also found deleted scenes from attachments, and one of the deleted scenes is with Lincoln, the main male character in that book, playing pinball. And very specifically, he is talking to somebody about how to play pinball, and they are not hitting the ball hard enough. And when he tells her to hit the ball harder, she says, "I don't want it to tilt." And he says, "It won't tilt, just hit it harder," kind of thing. That happens almost beat for beat inside of Corinne. So hilariously, one of the things that Amy took issue with was Enoch and Corinne drinking milk with his dinner. Apparently, people drinking milk is a thing that has happened a lot across Rainbow Rowell's books, enough that she addressed it. Like, somebody asked her, I think on Tumblr, like, why do people drink so much milk in your books? And she like has this whole thing about like, people drink milk, it's a thing, people drink lots of milk. Listen, I'm not saying that any one piece of this is like confirmation 100% Rainbow Rowell wrote this. I'm just saying the cumulative effect of all of this evidence is that I am now convinced that Rainbow Rowell wrote this. If Rainbow Rowell is not Rebecca Morrow, then somebody is out there, her evil twin is out there also writing books, or somebody who hates her is out there planting evidence. That's how I feel at the end of this. Like, I am pretty confident that this is who this is. Knowing that Rainbow Rowell wrote Corinne, it makes me feel like this story was trying to do a few things that it failed at. And it makes me feel like the romance and the romantic tension, that was what it was supposed to be. The blurb by Jodi Picoult on the cover of this that calls it like a Romeo and Juliet sort of story. The romantic tension was supposed to be the point. I don't think that it did that well. This is kind of where we are now. Rainbow Rowell probably wrote this book. I don't think it was a very good book. I think that it tried some things and succeeded, but mostly it tried some things and didn't succeed. And I wish that it had taken more time to actually think about the dynamics it created. I wish that this author really deconstructed more around sort of relationship, sex, purity, culture in fundamentalist churches. I wish that these two characters had better conversations, that they actually like talked about the things that happened between them, especially as teens, that they were able to really like heal and move on instead of just like circling each other in the way that they did. The ending of this is like horrific to me, if you consider that this was supposed to be a romance, particularly like everything that she's thinking at the end of the book is so incredibly sad to me, period, but especially if this is supposed to be a romance. What a wild ride this entire thing was. Like, I'm done. There's no more to do. There's no more research to do. But I don't know when I will be able to stop thinking about this. Honestly, I'd like to give a big thank you to Mara for inviting me to the live show, to Bethany and Ashley and Rachel, who had excellent theories on the live show and who continued to listen to all of my theories post the live show, and a special thank you to my Discord, who also listened to everything as I was laying it out and joined me on this bonkers journey into searching for more information, especially Amy, who did such great research into old Rainbow blog posts. You guys all are awesome. Thank you so much. That's it for me today. If you have read or would like to read Corinne by Rebecca Morrow, let's chat down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. This was so much fun. Reading it wasn't so much fun, but like the stuff after, totally so much fun.